Oscar, it's great to see you again, sir.
Yeah, good to see you too, man.
Yeah, it's been a whole week.
Whole week. It feels like we just did this yesterday, though. This week
Yeah,
flew by.
it has flown by, and we were talking about Juneteenth last time,
Yeah.
and today is Juneteenth.
Yes.
So because it's Juneteenth, I have a few things that I wear that are either African or African inspired, but what I'm wearing today is actually my Black Star Ghana soccer jersey,
Very nice.
which I like because it's kind of modern, has the flag. The team is called the Black Stars, and it goes all the way back to Marcus Garvey. And so I love the history, and because coming from a people that, I don't know which country my ancestors came from.
Right.
But after doing some research and doing one of those tests, the 23andMe.
Right.
By the way, we should talk about that on another class.
That's a very good idea. I've done it too. We have a lot to say about that.
We have a lot.
Yeah.
But Ghana was on there, and so I need a team to cheer for in sports. And I need a place that I want to be able to say I came from, not just a giant continent.
Yeah.
So Ghana is my country.
Well, they are offering citizenship to Americans that want to go back and get it. Some people have done that.
Yeah, I've seen that. So, once I get rich, or
Right.
once we can travel, then
That's true.
We're looking
Yeah,
I have
you need to get there first.
I need to get there, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, today we have a bunch to talk about. So one of the first things is that why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we doing this class? And initially, it was because people asked for it. Our former students wanted to talk about these modern events, and they asked for it. So everything we've been doing has been with them in mind.
Yeah.
But we've received more feedback that it seems like other groups are actually interested in hearing our conversations. Some people our age and older, if that's possible, are interested in hearing what we're talking about, not just our former history kids. So at the end of this class, we've actually put together a little survey, kind of seeing who is interested in maybe doing this in more of a class format. Some people might just like the videos or even just the snippets of videos on Instagram, but we want to see who is interested in actually having some of these conversations. And you mentioned that given your current situation, you wanted to have more of these conversations. What were you saying?
Right. Yeah. So as you all know, I'm new to Maryland. I used to be in San Diego, and I feel personally, I feel a need to connect with other teachers, especially teachers of color, and talk to each other about how we're navigating these moments, especially given where I'm teaching now. I've got great students. They're very nice kids. It is my first time teaching in a more middle upper class setting with more white students and wealthy Asian students. My Asian students in San Diego were low income, like all my students were low income in San Diego. And so I'm used to a certain level of diversity among my students and my colleagues. So with all these protests and the marches and the intense focus on race, to the point that you really can't avoid it. You really got to have conversations among teachers around how we're going to adapt our curriculum to have students understand the context of the situation that we're in. And that requires really difficult conversations that require teachers to open up about themselves. And maybe I'll get there with my colleagues. I just don't know enough of them yet. And my colleagues are not very diverse. And so, when you reached out to me and saying, hey, our students want to talk to us, I really want to talk to our students because I know they're adults now. And so I thought of this as an alumni space, like an advisory space for adults now who are all navigating this in all kinds of ways. But also I want to have this also be a space for some little space for educators of color to talk to each other about how we're going to educate the next generation so that they understand what their role is in this period. So for me, I love connecting with alumni. I would like to have some part of this be for educators as well.
Okay. Well, we have a Google Classroom space. And so we're kind of trying to think about, should we have a couple of cohorts? What type of grouping should we have? And so educators of color might be a grouping that we have on there. And speaking in other colleagues, shout out Christabel Tan. One thing she mentioned is that that white educators can feel more comfortable talking about race starting from a place where it's all white educators in the same space, because then they don't have to feel as guilty or they don't feel the guilt that comes with trying to be polite in the same space as educators of color. And so it's a good start. Go.
Everyone is welcome in the space.
Everyone but 4-year-olds are welcome in the space. So point being, let me get back to my train of thought.
Well, I think a point to kind of continue a little bit, we need white educators to be involved in this. And sometimes they can be uncomfortable because, they've been raised not to deal head on with this. And so I think for a lot of other people, they're having to unlearn some of the things that they've been taught. And, if they are making a good faith effort in doing this, I think there's a bit of messiness that's allowed. And I certainly have a tolerance for that. And so there's conversations that we need to have with them. There's conversations they need to have amongst themselves. Like, white people need to talk to other white people too. And there's some that we need to have amongst ourselves as well. So for me, I'm very open to whatever this turns into. Really depends on what people want. I think we both love learning. We both love teaching and being transparent about what we do. So I'm just excited about this, the potential for what we're doing.
I am too. All right, well, like I mentioned, after this, you should be able to find a link with a little questionnaire. If you are interested in being involved in a more classroom environment, then fill that out and we will see what the responses are and group people up. So go ahead and do that. Next, we have some big things that have happened this week. 2 very important Supreme Court decisions happened this week. Bam, wait a couple more days, bam. What were they?
Right. So just to back up, June is a big Supreme Court month. Every Monday and Thursday towards the end of June. So always around graduation, the Supreme Court rules out all these major decisions. And because we've been on quarantine, I kind of forgot that, I forget which day Monday is. And so suddenly my phone starts blowing up about the Supreme Court case with LGBTQ protections. And so I said, oh, that's right. That case is there. So that's a really big deal. And so, if hopefully people have at least seen the headlines, maybe it's inspired them to learn more about it. In a nutshell, it has to do with trans rights and gay rights, and whether those rights are located in protections against sexual discrimination, as opposed to having to pass a new law that specifically singles people out for trans and gay status for employment protections. And so the Supreme Court said that trans and gay people have protections against employment discrimination, and they're based on protections against sexual discrimination, which is huge because you don't have to pass a new law. And now they've interpreted that way, and it applies across the country. And so when you look at the law that it was, it's an amazing way that I guess I'll skip to the lesson for me, which is that when you pass protections to protect the most oppressed people, others benefit. So, their protections come from the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So, when you think of the Civil Rights Movement, you don't think of LGBT protections. But that's where it came from, because that law, in addition to banning segregation in hotels and restaurants and places like that, it also included protections against sex discrimination to help out women. And it's there that LGBTQ people have these rights. And so I've explained this to my students during the school year. I say, if my wife goes into her classroom, and says, I have a big announcement to make. I want y'all to know I identify as a woman, and I want you to refer to me as she, her, hers as her pronouns. There wouldn't be a big deal, because in the minds of anybody, there would be no disconnect between how my wife presents and her asking to be referred to as a woman with the pronouns. Now, if I went to my, my workplace and said, hey guys, I have an announcement. I identify as a woman, and I want you to refer to me as she, her, hers. In some states, I could be fired. I could be evicted from my home with no recourse, because those states would not recognize any kind of protections against discrimination in that way. And so the Supreme Court decided that the difference between those two situations of my wife and myself going to a workplace and saying the same thing would be sex. It would be that I would be punished because I would be exhibiting behaviors that many people would think would be unacceptable given my sex. And so you can't look at trans rights and gay rights without considering the sex discrimination implicit in that. And so in deciding that, that means that LGBTQ people now have rights against employment discrimination, and they were rooted in the civil rights movement. So, we're going to get to this, but this is why you support other people's movements, not just because you should for their own good, but also because there's a ripple effect. And at some point it might benefit you too. And even if it doesn't benefit you, that's okay. You should still support them just because it's the right thing to do. So okay. It's a huge decision.
It's huge. Let me ask one more question with it. So couldn't we just pass a new law? Why?
I mean, yeah.
I got to say it with a straight face.
Yes, of course.
Pass a new law that would be approved by the president to.
Exactly. Yeah. So you'd have to pass a law that passes the Democratic House and the Republican Senate, and then would be signed by President Trump. I mean, yes, that's always an option. And just to ask it, we all laugh. We're like, could you pass a law? Yeah. I think some critics would say that the Supreme Court is legislating, but you had Gorsuch who wrote the decision. So I mean, that's a conservative Trump appointee that wrote the decision. So it's that's a strong statement from the Supreme Court.
All right, and then the other big decision, which affects many of our former students, some of our coworkers, some of our current students, is the DACA decision. That came yesterday, Thursday, the 18th. And so that decision, didn't just not change anything?
It didn't change anything, which is good, because I think everybody, and I think a lot of people were assuming that that the worst case would happen, which is that the Supreme Court would rule in President Trump's favor, that would allow him to end the DACA program. And that's the program that gave people who were brought to the United States by their parents temporary status to get their education, to get their jobs, and at least be secure, from the fear of being deported. And I have to be honest that this is a case that I was purposely not watching very closely, because some things hit closer to home, and for my sake, I needed to not stay up to date with it. And it's given me some insight into why some of my Black friends don't want to talk about police violence all the time. That hits close to home, and they certainly don't want people sending them images and asking them all the time. This is the kind of case that I actually have not wanted to talk much about, because it is so close. But the Supreme Court ruled again that President Trump was not allowed to end the program the way that he did. It's not that he can't end it. It's the way that he did it. So
I wanted to, that's one thing that I want everyone who is listening to this in the class to know. All this did was keep things the same. Now, if the ruling would have went the other way, it would have been a big deal.
Yeah.
Understand that this can still be challenged, just in a different way.
Yeah.
They could, it was basically that the way that they tried to end DACA was just a poor reason for ending it.
He said it was illegal when Obama did it, and then he tried to undo the entire thing. And so if he had taken a little more of a thorough approach to it and made some more arguments and and ended certain provisions of it while keeping others, you know, in still enacted, maybe would have passed muster. But the fact that basically they did it so sloppily that they said, well, you can't do it that way. He can try again. He probably will try again. So that it just restarted the clock for him. And, you know, for people who support DACA, it means that if he's reelected, then he can do it again. And so he gets 4 more years to try again. It really puts the focus back on the election, and it puts the focus back on the Senate. You know, if you really want to protect dreamers, and not just the DACA people, but the dreamers who didn't qualify for DACA, you've got to pass immigration reform, kind of going back to what we were laughing about, which is that you've got to pass a law to finally solidify those protections. And you can't do that the way things work right now. It would have to be Democrats in the House, Senate, and in the White House to do that. So I think it's a reminder that we haven't talked much about presidential politics in the race yet. I understand that not everybody is excited about Biden. You know, it's not the most, you know, I think we all understand that. But if you care about things like DACA, it's going to require a Democratic House and a Senate and a president to even have a chance to do those things. To have President Trump be reelected means he has 4 more years to then try to undo DACA in a way that the Supreme Court would okay. And they probably would okay some version of it.
And you got to keep in mind, I don't think Ruth Bader Ginsburg is making it another 4 years. And so that means that Trump would then have his choice for another conservative judge.
Oh yeah. I mean, so if he has 4 more years, he's going to bake in that majority for the next generation. So this is not 2016 where people, I think, have the luxury of deciding what kind of person that, is closest to their ideals. It's a pretty clear choice with something like DACA. At least if you support DACA, it's a pretty clear choice what you need to do.
And another interesting thing about immigrant rights and the conversation around that is that immigrants that are not citizens can't vote.
Right.
So it is easy for Trump in this case to have anti-immigrant policies because he's not scaring away voters.
Right.
Voters that are also anti-immigrant are going to agree with that, but the immigrants themselves can't vote in the United States, or the group of immigrants we're talking about with DACA.
Right.
So it's really interesting the way it plays out as far as elections go as well.
Yeah, it really does. It really does.
So we talked in our little demo lesson, we talked about being an ally. And one thing that people that have given us feedback keep coming back to is that you just looked at it as being a friend and supporting your friends. And so both of these cases, the DACA case and the LGBTQ plus decision, both of those didn't involve me. They didn't involve some of my privileges, which are being a citizen here. Another privilege that I have is that I am in a heterosexually created society. And so I fit in with what the default sexual preference is. And so, but all of this was kind of started because we're talking about a lot of these Black rights decisions. So you alluded to how there's a support system that these should be victories for us all. If we want there to be rights for underrepresented people, then all of these have an intersection. So it's funny because when we texted on the day that the decision happened, the LGBTQ plus decision, you said, do you feel like it's a victory? I think that's what you texted me.
Yeah, I said, and because obviously yes, but it was like, do you feel it? Like it's like you feel it inside that it's a victory for you. And yeah, that decision for me is one that I'm very happy. It doesn't hit me in the same way. Even in talking about it, it doesn't hit me in the same way as talking about DACA does. And DACA doesn't hit me either. It's just that I'm closer to a lot more people that DACA is. And so, it's important. It's important because even if it's not personal to me, because you also never know, like we're both raising kids. You know, I don't know what my son, you know, who he's going to be. You know, I think we all have assumptions, but you can't. And so, you know, whatever he grows into, you know, I would hope that he has all the same freedoms and is not in any kind of fear of being unfairly judged for who he is, because you can never tell. And even beyond that, for me, with the LGBTQ plus decision, I have to just think about that. It's even if you know my son grows up heterosexual, it's still important and it still matters, and we have to train ourselves to make it matter as deeply as if it was something that really did affect us you know, directly.
All right. So, and that's part of being an ally.
Yes.
Okay. We're going to go ahead and move on to another thing. So we just discussed victories, but and there have been a lot of victories with the Black Lives Matter movement since you know, in the last month. But I always had a feeling that the pendulum was going to start swinging the other way.
Yeah.
So it's not all Ben and Jerry's posting about about systematic racism.
Yeah.
It's not all my Alexa TV says Black Lives Matter. And
Did it really?
For all the black shows right up front. It's not all, you know,
Confederate statues being toppled over.
Confederate statues being toppled over. It's also, the pendulum also goes the other way. And so one of the big things that's happened lately is, I think in the last week, 4 either Black or Latino males have committed suicide by hanging, which hanging in public, which is not something that falls in line with what men do if they take their own life, and especially not what minority men do when they take their own life. And so people are saying that these aren't suicides, these are lynchings, modern day lynchings.
Yeah.
And so why would they be ruled a suicide? If we're looking at all the things that have happened in the last month, what goes into ruling them a suicide?
What goes into?
Sorry, I know you weren't ready for this, but I am. So who is it? I'm not asking you this question. This is a rhetorical question. Who is the group that decides a cause of death? It's usually. I'm sorry. Now I can ask you.
So I mean, I think we're assuming. I haven't. Again, this is a case where I have not read as much because I get a little bit of distance there. But are we getting the suicide cause of death from the police?
Yes. Yes.
That's who's saying it. Okay, so we're getting.
The department is giving that as a cause of death.
Right.
And so I am not saying that this is. Each case may be individual, but it seems like a trend.
Right.
And if the police force chooses and everyone that is part of that force chooses to look at a lynching and rule it as a suicide, then, and that's what their investigation concludes, what power do we as a people have to investigate it differently? Right.
I guess even before we go there, I would just say that, you know, when the police rule something like this a suicide, they're assuming that these pronouncements carry weight and carry legitimacy because we trust what they say. And if they want people to trust what they say, because it very well may be true. I mean, I don't think it is, but it may be true that these are all just 5 coincidental suicides. But if the police want the benefit of the doubt, their job is to carry themselves in a way that fosters that sense that we would give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think what we've been seeing for the last couple of weeks is that they've behaved in a way explicitly that would make everybody question what they say. And so when they say it's a suicide, it just boggles my mind that they would expect people to take them at their word. Because at this point, why would you do that?
Well, and when we see in Atlanta, probably the biggest city with the largest Black population, we see that there are a number of officers who have called in sick, that they're understaffed, and that this all looks like it's, again, the pendulum swinging back. This is the officers or the police force. It seems like they are trying to show how important they are,
Yeah.
and how needed they are because of the rhetoric around defund the police. And so that's what this seems like. Now, not calling in sick to work is a lot different than calling in sick to work is a lot different than mislabeling a crime.
Right.
One is not being there, and the other is intentionally mislabeling something. And so I think there are degrees to this, but it does seem like police forces are coming together and they are being defiant against these changes that people are trying to make.
Yeah, I think at the very least, we're seeing that these protests have entered a new phase. I mean, they're these initial killings, the pushback from the people, and the police were on the defensive, and now they're pushing back some. And as the Americans have a short attention span, the media's going to move on. We're not seeing these protests being covered on a day-to-day basis. And as the police push back, I think the onus is back on not just the activists, but I think more like the middle part of Americans that don't usually talk about police issues. It's on them. Are they still willing to push back on the police, or are they gonna be scared by the fact that police are not showing up for work? And I think there's a lot of potential there for some of that support for these protests to weaken. And I'm worried that some of the progress, might be in jeopardy as people get bored and as that support starts to wane.
So the last thing we'll talk about today, for today's friendly fire, we're going to talk about the term defund the police.
Right.
So right after the Black Lives Matter movement of the past month and some change happened, a new slogan came out, defund the police. Now, you and I have some very similar feelings about this issue, about this term, but we are still going to be on opposing sides right now for the sake of debate.
Sure.
So what side are you taking with defund the police?
My side is that we can't abandon the phrase because it is so catchy. And so when I started seeing defund the police appear everywhere, in my mind, it struck me as a phrase as catchy, on par with "Make America Great Again" or "Build the Wall." Yes, we can. It's 3 or 4 words. What's that?
Lock her up.
Lock her up. Feel the burn. Again, Americans tend to latch on to very short phrases. It's only a couple of words. We understand what all those words mean. We may not understand what they all mean together.
But that's the thing. That's the problem. I don't think that people understand what they all mean together.
Right.
Defund the police sounds like we want no law.
Right.
And so I think that the term is scaring people away that would be in favor of the movement when they understood that that movement is actually about supporting law enforcement in a different way. Yeah,
and I agree with that. But the reason why I think we should keep it is because it is so catchy that...
Well, actually, before we go further into that, can we talk a little bit about what it means? Are you froze?
I think that's part of the debate, though. So I'll get to that. So I think the idea with it, though, is that if you run away from it, it is so catchy that, I can imagine President Trump would say, the Democrats want to defund the police, and someone else is going to fill in the, color in the lines, fill in the blanks, what have you. So if the movement doesn't define it, somebody else is in bad faith. And so, what does it mean? the way that I explain certain things to my students, again, I always think about how I explain to my students is tools in a toolbox, you know. And if you're trying to do some work and you go into your toolbox and you see that you have, like, you know, you got a wrench, you got a saw, a screwdriver, and a hammer. Okay, you got a range of tools. If you see a nail, you're gonna hammer that nail. Okay, great. But then if you have to unscrew something and then you go back to the hammer and you're unscrewing something, you know, with a hammer because you love that one tool, and then you have to cut some wood, and so you're going to grab that hammer again, just kind of cut the wood with the hammer. You know, you're doing a terrible job because you're using the same tool in the wrong situation. And that tool has a specific purpose, and for whatever reason, you're in love with that one tool, and you want to apply it everywhere with destructive effects. I think what Defund the Police is
in support of instead of using, like you said, I'll leave this tool analogy,
sure.
But there are a lot of cases where we have homeless people.
Exactly.
And there are laws that make it so that homeless people have no place to go.
Exactly.
And we took some of the funds from the police that have to move homeless people around, and we use that to actually house homeless people. Those funds would make less criminals because
exactly.
police wouldn't have to criminalize people. And maybe people that are actually experts in helping homeless people would be able to do that.
Right. So defund the police is reduce the budgets of the police department, focus them on where we actually need them focused. And I don't really know where that is, honestly, because we don't use the police that much in suburbs. I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has talked about,
I just saw
you look at suburbs, and if we took that as the standard for everywhere, we wouldn't use them that much. So, but we do need the police for something. So fine, whatever that is, fund that.
Violent crime, we need the police.
Yeah, all that other money invested in areas that would actually reduce the need for police, like education, like healthcare, like housing,
mental health.
Yeah, and that's what defund the police is. It's restrict them to their essential mission, take that money, invest it in other areas that are more proven to reduce the need for police.
And let experts and fund experts in other areas. Being a police officer is a hard job.
Yeah, it is hard.
And why not let them specialize?
Yeah.
Instead of having them be psychologists as well.
Yeah. As an example, San Diego Unified has an $80 million deficit. San Diego Police Department has a $500 million budget. You know, you can't just give the money over, but there's a lot of money there in the police department that can be better spent elsewhere.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap up week 2, day 1 right now. All right. Follow us on Instagram. It's right there on your screen. And also, I want to thank at BH_HT, who is our producer. That's Brian Tran. He does this actually for a living as well. So just wanted to make sure to give him a shout out. All right. What does that term even mean? What is a race scholar?
Well, you know, it's an identity that I'm coming into, and one that really, that I connected with, especially in undergrad at Duke, because it's, you know, for me, talking from my own personal experience, it was a very white, wealthy place that was so different from Croy.